Good morning, good afternoon, good day, wherever you are. Welcome to this discussion on how feasible are net zero pledges in the Global South. My name is Zainab Osman, and I am the Director of the Africa Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. At the Carnegie Endowment's Africa Program, we focus on the economic, the political, and the transnational issues shaping Africa today and that are of relevance to the continent's future. A key objective of our work is to shape global discourse and policy on Africa towards outcomes that advance prosperity, peace, and stability for these countries. Today's discussion is timely. As we know, climate change is the defining challenge of our time. This challenge is even more acute for emerging markets and developing economies. We have seen the effects of rising temperatures in terms of heat waves in India, floods in Nigeria, droughts and rising sea levels in other parts of the world. According to the IPCC's special report, global warming of 0.1.5 degrees Celsius, the world must get to net zero by 2050 and net negative thereafter if the targets of the Paris Agreement are to be met. Thus, over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen several countries announcing net zero commitments, meaning that they intend to balance their greenhouse gas emissions with removals from the atmosphere by 2050 or thereabouts. Against this backdrop, in November 2021, at the United Nations Climate Conference in Glasgow, President Buhari of Nigeria and Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India announced net zero emissions pledges for their countries by 2060 and 2070, respectively. As the third largest greenhouse gas emitter globally, India's commitment to net zero is one of the key outcomes of the conference last year. Yet, given that the country is still decades away from peak economic growth and energy demand, the announcement raises questions on the practicality and feasibility of the timeline. India, as we all know from recent projections by the United Nations, is set to become the world's most populous country by next year or 2024. Nigeria's own announcement also raised similar questions. The country's transition plan outlined at COP26 allows for limited increase in the country's total emissions through 2025, with steep reductions thereafter. This short period of limited increase and subsequent reductions will have to occur against the backdrop of population and economic growth, balancing the priorities of reducing emissions on one hand, while pursuing economic growth and creating quality jobs for millions of Nigerians on the other. Is really a complicated challenge. And again, drawing on those UN projections, Nigeria is set to become the world's third most populous country by 2050, or even before. So it's clear that compared to high-income countries, emerging markets and developing economies are in the unique situation of not necessarily transitioning from carbon-intensive economic infrastructure, but rather they are attempting to create a new and untested low carbon model. This process is inherently reliant on technological advancements, some of which do not exist or even do not exist at scale and at the economic viability needed. By their nature, these advancements are difficult to predict, which further complicates the matter of creating an effective timeline for achieving net zero emissions. Politically, achieving net zero will require targeted investments, important trade-offs, and the formation of adequate policy and legal environments to encourage adoption of green technology. And we all know right now that there are serious headwinds in the global economy. We still have a lingering COVID-19 pandemic, there are trade wars among the major powers of the world, and there are also hot wars actually happening right now, especially in Europe. And we just might be headed for a global recession. So with all of these, the question a lot of us are asking is, how feasible is achieving net zero pledges in countries in the global south? What financing, resources, and technologies are needed to make headway on this front? Is it even fair to hold all countries to the same green transition timeline? What should we expect as we head up to COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt? So these are some of the questions, definitely not easy questions, that we are hoping to cover in the discussion today over the next 1 hour. And I have here with me a panel of eminent scholars who are well positioned to address these questions. So I have Professor Chuks Okereke. He is the director of the Center for Climate Change and Development at Alex Ekweme Federal University, and he is a visiting professor at the universities of Reading and Oxford in the United Kingdom. He is a globally recognized leading scholar on global climate governance and international development with expertise in climate justice, national green growth transition in Africa, climate adaptation, and business climate strategies. I also have Professor Navroz Dubash. He is a professor at the Center for Policy Research, a New Delhi-based think tank, and an adjunct senior research fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. He has been actively engaged in global and national debates on climate change, air quality, energy and water as a researcher, policy and advisor, and activist for over 25 years. And finally, we have Professor Philippe Benoit. He is an adjunct senior research scholar at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, where he leads the center's Energy for Development initiative. He is also research director at Global Infrastructure Analytics and Sustainability 2050. He previously worked for over 15 years at the World Bank with a focus on Africa and Latin America, and also at the International Energy Agency. So over the next 1 hour or so, we're going to have a rich and informative discussion with these three eminent scholars, and then we will open up for questions and answers briefly for another 10 minutes or so. So I think I would like to start with Professor Dubash, if we can bring him onto the screen. Professor Dubash, I was wondering if you could walk us through what was really the background to the net zero announcement for India at COP26 last year, because it was one of the major emerging market and developing economies to make that announcement. What preparatory work was done in advance of that political commitment, and what other information can you provide to us on this front?
Well, first of all, Zainab, thank you very much for having me on this conversation, and I really look forward to hearing from Chuks and Philip. I think it'll be a great hour or so that we'll spend together. So, the answer to your question about the backdrop to India's net zero target is really, while one doesn't know the murky details, I think it's very clear that there was a full court diplomatic press on India, as on a few other developing countries, in the build-up to Glasgow, to try and get, in a sense, India to agree to some form of net zero target. And the way I interpret that is that there was a broader global narrative at stake, this narrative about keeping 1.5 alive. And without India and a few other large emerging economies being clear about what their net zero year might be, it's actually very hard to even do the math to figure out if net zero could be kept alive. You can't have big gaps in your greenhouse gas accounting off into the future. And so the countries like India had to kind of, in a sense, play nicely in order for that global narrative for Glasgow to work. My question really is whether that global narrative is as useful. So it serves a certain purpose in terms of global politics. But my question is it serve an equivalently useful purpose when it comes to national politics? And this is where I have been arguing within India and elsewhere that actually what animates domestic politics and domestic change is far more likely to be sectoral and more sort of shorter term pledges about transitions in sectors like electricity, in sectors like urbanization, in thinking about the development of freight corridors. These are things that actually can be knit and woven into domestic development narratives. It brings together the development and the climate conversation, and therefore a domestic politics can really be built around those things. the domestic conversation around climate, qua climate, if you like. So the net zero target framing is essentially a mitigation framing. It says how much does India care about climate change in and of itself? And really, if you look at opinion polls and so on, it's not going to be in the top few issues, right? And I don't think it will be for some time to come in a country like India. And so I think the much more progressive and useful and creative politics lies in bringing climate and development together. Let me make one more point about net zero, and this is all a somewhat long-winded way of saying there wasn't really that much domestic analysis done at all in India to look at when India might get to a net zero target, because it was seen as politically off the table until suddenly it wasn't because of the diplomatic press. Now, the other reason not that much preparation or analysis was done is that for countries like India, where emissions are growing, because you're starting at a very low base, so just around 2 tons of emissions per capita, a third that of world average. When you're starting at such a low base and your emissions are growing, analytically, it's very hard to pin down a net zero story, because is India's trajectory going to be a mountain, or is it going to be a little hillock? When are we going to peak? There are so many more degrees of freedom. And really what we should be talking about is, how does a country like India squeeze more development out of every unit of carbon? That's the right metric to be asking. And that's not a question that the net zero framing lends itself to, actually. So I think we should be thinking more in terms of narratives around low carbon development, maybe even sort of green growth type narratives, looking at trade-offs and synergies between development and climate change. The net zero conversation doesn't already open the door very much to all those things.
Wonderful. I think this is such a good introduction, and it's very interesting to hear that there wasn't as much preparatory work done in advance of the announcement itself as one would have hoped or one would have thought. And part of the reason, as you mentioned, is because there seems to be this gap, to put it mildly, between this kind of big global narrative on mitigation around net zero or meeting net zero targets, and domestic policy processes, which then affect the feasibility of meeting or achieving these pledges. Now, I want to bring in Chooks, Professor Chikumarije. So now I'm curious, because again, we remember COP26 because India made that announcement, and then I think a day or two later, Nigeria made that announcement. And in the case of Nigeria's announcement, the country aims to hit that net zero target by 2060, 10 years before India, which is very, very interesting. So having heard from Navros, what was the situation in Nigeria? What were the dynamics at play? Was there any preparatory work done? Can you give us some insights on that front?
Thank you, Zainab, for having me. It is a pleasure to share a platform with you and, of course, with Navros and Philip. The context that Navros described is not too far from what happened in Nigeria. In the run-up to COP26, Nigeria had committed to, like most other countries, ratchet up its NDC. The process of ratcheting up the NDC, the first NDC, by the way, promised emission reduction of about 25% without help, and up to 40% with international support. And the pressure was to ratchet up the ambition in the run-up to COP26. And for that, the government held a number of town hall meetings. You could debate the efficacy of that, the quality of the contribution, but at least there was some type of attempt to open the process up to national conversation, because tons of research has shown that just making announcements without some kind of national discussion leads to a shiny shelf document, which often is not implemented. And there was a cry that this was the manner in which the first NDC announcement was made. So you could say that the government had learned the lessons and was opening up the process of the ratcheting of the NDC to a much more broader stakeholder consultation, which was good. By the side of it, there was also another process that was going on, which was the elaboration of the long-term vision. The long-term vision was supposed to be an anchor for a much, more quantitative long-term emission development strategy or growth. So some of us were kind of involved in these two processes. Little did we know that something else was also cooking behind the scene with far less visibility than the ratcheting up of the NDC and the LTV. This thing that was cooking behind was happening at the office of the vice president, where the eminent vice president, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, was working together with international consultant McKinsey to think about the possibility of a net zero target for Nigeria. In my view, clearly in response to some kind of international pressure to service the global narrative of keeping 1.5 alive, which the UK government desperately needed to showcase a successful COP26. And do not get me wrong, slightly maybe unlike Navrov, I do see the need for some kind of net zero target for all countries, as much as can afford it. However, the idea that you can cook up a net zero target, at the back door without some kind of national conversation seems to me very questionable, if not ludicrous. Nigeria is in between a rock and a hard place when it comes to climate change. On the one hand, it is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world, so some kind of action is urgently required, and it's so well okay for Nigeria to try and lead from the front by making ambitious global targets. But at the same time, Nigeria is also an oil-dependent economy, and poverty is rampant. Over 62% of Nigerians live in poverty, and over 87% of its foreign receipts come from oil and gas. Therefore, any attempt to win Nigeria off of oil and gas and move to a net zero need to embody a very serious conversation about the timelines and the plans and the concrete steps that need to be taken. Now, since the announcement of the net zero by the president, surprisingly, at COP26, more has emerged about the plan on which it was predicated, and you referenced a little bit of that is based on the ETP, which was drawn on by McKinsey. The problem is multiple-fold, but let me just mention two. Number one, looking at the plan, you see that actually it's basically what it says is an energy transition plan, and it's hardly a net zero GHG plan because it does not accommodate AFOLU. And AFOLU is the second biggest source of emission in Nigeria. Some will argue the biggest. Secondly, the calculator that was used to produce it is proprietary, which means that many of us who are climate scientists in the country do not have access to judge its veracity. And of course, I'm not saying that it is dubious, but at least if this source of calculation is supposed to be used or has been used to set such a tremendously important target for Nigeria, surely it should be open for everyone to be able to go back and check the numbers that are used. And thirdly, of course, I have already highlighted the problem of lack of consultation. So in summary, that was the process through which net zero was made. I'm not opposed to the net zero. I think some kind of target is okay, but it is almost harmful to set a target where you don't have the necessary logistical and technological and broad social and political commitment to deliver. It's almost as harmful to set a target that you cannot deliver as not to set a target at all. So that is the context, and I'm sure I'm going to come back again to elaborate on some more specifics. Thank you.
Great, wonderful, very, very, very insightful to hear that. To kind of draw on certain similarities between what we've heard with respect to the process in Nigeria and with the process in India, and also some differences. So in the case of Nigeria, as you've just told us, that given that the government experienced a bit of a backlash from the first NDC process, decided to take a slightly more consultative approach with updating Nigeria's NDC, and also the process of producing a new national development plan. But then, unknown to a lot of stakeholders, including people like yourself, there was a parallel process underway that was probably not as inclusive as it should have been. And then, interestingly, uses methods and metrics that are quite proprietary, with the methodologies not entirely available to a lot of stakeholders in the country, which then creates all these other interesting dynamics. But what I'm hearing overall is that, we have a situation where we have this major global challenge. We need to bring different countries around the world together towards a common objective. And sure, there's a global narrative around getting to net zero by 2050 or thereabouts. But then this narrative does not seem to, or the way it's kind of being promoted, in a sense, does not really align with domestic policy processes and politics in a lot of countries, meaning that then we could end up with a situation where, first of all, multilateralism is already facing a lot of headwinds. And then you don't have the buy-in of very important countries like India and Nigeria and others. I'm sure when we talk to people in Indonesia, they might probably tell us something similar. So at this point, then I want to bring in Philippe. Philippe, with what we're hearing from Chooks and Navros, that we have global processes underway and certain global narratives, and they're well-intentioned, but they don't seem to, the way they're kind of being promoted, by different stakeholders at the global level, but also in the respective countries, we don't really see that people are being carried along. We don't see that they're aligning very much with development realities on the ground, with aspirations, with priorities, with policy processes. What do you see is the main reason for this disconnect we're seeing? And what else have you heard with respect to other developing countries, other emerging markets on this front?
Well, thanks a lot for that, and very interesting interventions by the two previous speakers, as well as your introductory intervention. I think I'm going to come back to some of these points in my opening remarks. The first is, I think it's very important to recognize that we're fundamentally talking about a global narrative that needs to be supported by domestic action. And from my perspective, a net zero target decades out into the future serves a very important signaling purpose. It establishes a direction of travel. But what is critical is what is going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years. Now, one important point I would like to make, in contrast to, I think, a point Navros made, is as much as carbon intensity of development is a critical metric, the reality is when we look at the carbon budget and the climate goals, absolute levels of emissions are also critical. And as we project into the future, what we see is that the global south is becoming increasingly important in the emission story. It also, interestingly enough, is becoming increasingly important in the energy story as well, and I'll come back to that. But in some ways, when we think about the feasibility of the global south achieving net zero, I think it's important to put it in a broader geopolitical context. So a couple of points. The first is when we're talking about the global south, it's important to emphasize that there's a great diversity across this grouping, as is illustrated by the two countries we have today, India and Nigeria. But there are also important common elements, Zainab, that you talked about, and the other speakers. And the most important in this context is the development challenges these countries face. Their need to not only raise people out of extreme poverty, but also to provide even higher more robust standards of living in health, education, housing, and more. So the net zero challenge for the global South differs from that of the global North, precisely because the South must merge lower emissions with critical economic and social development. And to do that, the global South will require more energy. And in our current context, more energy makes it more difficult to lower emissions. Now, another related point that I'd like to come to is the whole issue of that you touched upon, equity and also leadership and influence. Those are dynamics that are key. And in that regard, the global North has taken a hit. Right? The U.S. position internationally has been undermined by the shift from President Obama to President Trump's climate policy hostility and back again to President Biden. And in fact, there's uncertainty as to who will be governing the United States in 4 or 5 years and what will the climate policies look like. And that obviously has undermined the ability of the U.S. to lead in this regard. But even Europe, which has been consistent on climate, is now seeing its standing being undermined by the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So at the same time, the European Union and the G7 and organizations like the World Bank that they guide look to cut funding for gas and other fossil fuel projects in the global South, they're making plans to increase LNG production and exports for the United States. These developments are likely to undermine the leadership of the EU in pushing for net zero at a global level. And while some may want to draw a certain satisfaction from this weakened position, let me throw out 2 cautionary notes. The first is, as much as we may talk about development and poverty alleviation, which are critical, the fact of the matter is that the global South will suffer more than the North from climate change, precisely because it is poorer and more vulnerable. It's in too many ways less able to adapt and resist a changing climate than richer countries. So the loss of international leadership on avoiding climate change will hurt India and Nigeria and other southern countries. Yes, the North will suffer. We're seeing today massive heat waves across Western Europe and Texas, but the global South will suffer even more from dangerous levels of climate change. And the second is, while various energy exporters from the global South raise the valid point that they shouldn't be blocked from exploiting and exporting their oil and gas reserves as richer countries continue to do so, the force of that argument is undermined by the reality that all too often, too much of these oil revenues have gone into the pockets of a few elites and have not been used to fight poverty. So that the moral force of that equity argument is undermined by the governance weaknesses in these countries. The North needs to do more funding. They haven't lived up to the $100 billion pledge. And in fact, when you look at estimates, basically you need anywhere from $600 billion to $1 trillion of annual investments in clean energy across the global South, as compared to today, which is at $150 billion. But one other point that I want to mention that hasn't really received the attention it deserves is that the global North needs to make more of an effort to cut its own emissions faster and more deeply. Not only do the emissions from richer countries worsen the climate change impacts to which the global South is particularly vulnerable, they eat up the common global carbon budget. And when it comes to net zero and the carbon budget, it's a zero-sum game. The more the global North emits, the less room there is for emissions from the global South. And I'd like to close then my introductory comments in that regard. But later on, I'd like to come to the critical point, which is what is it that the global South needs to do? And basically, that the global South needs to reorient its thinking less away from what the North can provide to it, but the type of domestic policies it needs to adopt to lead to its own development and its own efforts to protect itself from climate change.
Great, thank you so much, Philippe. I think you've covered a lot of topics, and I think a lot of issues that we're going to come back to, including, I would say, this, unfortunate and, to be very frank, unnecessary gap that we're seeing. I don't want to use another word like disconnect, but between wealthy countries and the lower income, middle income economies, and increasingly we're seeing that gap not only become wider, but that gap being acknowledged by policymakers themselves. So I know in the case of African countries, a number of African leaders have actually written very scathing opinion pieces in the past 1 or 2 years in major publications, The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, etc., drawing attention to some of these things you mentioned. But at the same time, I think we also don't want to let some of these policymakers get away with certain things. In the case of some oil-rich, resource-rich countries. They have had decades of revenue windfalls that they have not made judicious use of. So they have to bear some of the responsibility today, and they should not be allowed to get away with that scot-free. But I think you also raised the bigger issue that a lot of us are worried about the future of multilateralism more broadly, but how it really shapes the ability of different parts of the world to come to some kind of consensus, right, around our topic today, these net zero pledges, their feasibility, the financing, the technology, the resources needed. Um, and that really is quite crucial as we head up to COP27. The major economies, as you mentioned, the United States, the European Union, are all dealing with domestic challenges, political challenges that are calling into question the ability to provide this global leadership. And then I think the point you concluded your opening remarks with respect to the fact that developing countries need to start to think of solutions that are not necessarily dependent on these kind of north-south financial flows, north-south support and assistance is very, very important. Which is why now I think I want to bring in Navros again to the screen. He mentioned something very important about these other sectoral initiatives going on in India that in some ways have more potential in actually producing results with respect to whether it's emissions reduction, whether it's respect to moving to low carbon energy systems, low carbon infrastructure, or whether it's with respect to really trying to reimagine a low carbon development model. So Navros, do you want to walk us through what some of these initiatives are that you think could be promising and how they could be kind of, promoted and, more progress can be made on them?
Yeah, thank you, Zainab. I'd be delighted to. There's lots of points I'd love to engage Chucks and Philip on, but we may not have the time for that. But I might sneak in a couple here and there. I think where I come to this issue from is empirical. What I have seen over the last couple of decades, watching and somewhat engaging in Indian climate politics and policy, is that things move, action happens when a narrative is built around what India can gain from taking those actions. It is not because of pledges like a net zero pledge. It's not even because of intensity type pledges, right? What we find in India is that and I think this is true ultimately of most countries, when domestic constituencies align around something, then you find that policies change. So let's look in India. I think the biggest change that has happened is in the areas of energy efficiency and in the areas of promotion of renewable energy, in particular solar power. The solar mission in India really started life as an energy security measure. It was marketed internally as an energy security measure, and it was marketed globally as a climate measure. And that's fine. That to me is nothing duplicitous about that. That's creative politics. We have ramped that up steadily to the now very substantial figure of 450 gigawatts domestically. And one of the pledges that Prime Minister Modi made as part of the so-called Panchamrit pledges in Glasgow was 500 gigawatts of renewable energy. Now note that this was already in place as a domestic pledge, more or less. It was 450 renewable energy as a domestic pledge and 500 non-fossil fuel, including nuclear as a global pledge. So India tends to actually adopt an approach where its pledges follow domestic policies or domestic strategies that have more or less already been concretized, right? And I think, therefore, and that's kind of an interesting observation, as opposed to countries that make international pledges hoping that domestic action will catch up to those pledges or to induce greater domestic action. So the big question in India is, all right, we're going to build all this renewable energy. Will we build it fast enough? I don't know, but we will build a lot more renewable energy. So just to put this in context, 500 gigawatts is on a total grid that is today on the order of about 380 gigawatts. So it's more than the current grid today. It's a lot of renewable energy. The big challenge for a country like India is how do we manage the transition over time from so much more renewables to more coal? And that kind of transition is a development transition because the coal economy is very tightly intertwined with various development sectors. It's tightly intertwined, interestingly, with the railways because coal freight cross-subsidizes passenger rail, which is politically very important in India because it is the way in which migrants travel back and forth to their place of work and their place of and their home. And there's a huge migrant flow. And to keep the prices down for those migrants, coal is actually really important. The banking sector is very closely implicated with the coal sector because it has pumped a lot of money into ramping up domestic coal capacity over the last decade. So untangling all these things are not just climate problems; they're fundamentally problems about India's development trajectory. Let me take a second to give you a couple more. In India, there is a growing narrative about green growth and climate change as a possible economic opportunity. We have recently created a hydrogen mission. We have a cooling mission to try and make sure that the additional cooling needs are not met entirely through energy inefficient air conditioners, but also through passive means and through more efficient forms of air conditioning. We have an initiative to try and boost battery storage manufacturing in India through things like production-linked incentives. All of these things have emerged as a growing story about a low-carbon development future, the potential for job creation, and the potential for India to be more competitive. Now, the reason I was, and I want to just quickly sneak in a response to Chooks here, I'm not dismissing the net zero target. I think it's an important global signal, in particular for global investment and capital around new technologies. But if you're looking to those signals to drive domestic change, then I think we'll be looking in the wrong place. And I think we should also interrogate the assumption that there's no trade-off between those signals. I worry sometimes that the net zero signal ends up being a pressure cooker, like a release valve on a pressure cooker, to avoid these more challenging conversations about the next decade. And let's be clear, this game is going to be won or lost this next decade. So if we start talking about 2070, and let's just think about this for a second. Some of us on this call are old enough to remember 1970. If you try to predict what the energy system in 2022 would be like sitting in 1970, you wouldn't have had a prayer of success. And we're now trying to do, it's exactly the same period. And if anything, the speed of technology has sped up, right? So to imagine that we will make decisions today based on what we think 2070 is going to look like and get it right, to me beggars beggars belief. So I feel fine. We can talk about the long term, certainly talk about 2050 globally, send global signals, but not at the cost of thinking really hard about the next 10 years and what will animate domestic politics for the next 10 years. I'm going to hand over in a second, Zainab, but one more quick point, if I could, to Philippe, which is that the pushback from Philippe on intensity targets versus absolute emissions, sure. Ultimately, we are in a world of absolute emissions. But if we go down that road, Philippe, of asking developing countries to tell us in absolute terms what's going to happen, you're in a world of explicit negotiation over allocation of a finite carbon budget. And we've been there before. It doesn't get us anywhere because any sort of fairness metric applied to allocation of the carbon budget would basically have the US going to zero emissions tomorrow. And Europe going to zero emissions maybe the day after. So it's not a politically saleable prospect. So we have to find ways of building narratives that allow global progress, but also allow progress in our individual countries, right? And those have to be relatively consistent narratives.
You've said a lot there. That is, that could be subject for like a whole series of webinars there, right? So many fascinating and I would say very, very important points and questions actually that you raise. building. I really like what you said about, we have to build narratives that allow for global progress, national progress, but that also take into account the political feasibility of certain solutions that we put forward. And I think that really is going to be where a lot of global conversations are headed over the next few years, because we're seeing already those tensions emerging and arising, especially around emissions, around historical responsibility, things that people are a bit reluctant to talk about are going to become more, I think increasingly we will not be able to avoid putting them on the table. Now I want to bring in Chooks. And we've heard about what already has been done in India. And I guess I would want to ask you a similar question, but I would also put it slightly differently. Given that in the case of Nigeria, as we've learned, there are all these other parallel processes underway. And then this announcement was made that caught a lot of people by surprise, including a lot of even policymakers in the country, experts like yourself. But since then, what has happened so far? What initiatives have been put forward? I know a climate law was discussed in the legislature in Nigeria. What other sectoral initiatives, if any, have been put on the table or have been implemented or have been passed?
Thanks very much. Yes, let me start with the law that you mentioned. Not least because I happen to have played some role in that. So I led a group of people as the chairman of the technical review committee of the bill, the climate change bill in Nigeria. And the bill, well, which we eventually sent to the House, in my view, is quite fascinating, even perhaps revolutionary in many respects. The bill creates the National Council for Climate Change because we recognize that one of the challenges of scaling up climate ambition in a country like Nigeria, and this is also, by the way, true for many other countries, is the need to bring climate change into agriculture, into transportation, into energy, into power, and sometimes many environmental ministries lack that gravitas, that power, that political muscle. And so we believe that having a national council that is chaired by the president helps to mainstream climate change into the various key sectors. Apart from, of course, leveraging the political stature of the president and the vice to also engage in international diplomacy and hopefully attract the quantum of climate finance that kind of is relatively matches the scale of the challenge at hand. Interestingly, there was a lot of pushback, in some cases from unlikely quarters, against the bill. Some people who thought they were going to lose power or position as a result of this bill. But interestingly, the president signed it into law a few weeks after COP26. And so now Nigeria is proud, I believe, to join the elite of some countries that have a global or framework climate change law that requires Nigeria to set some kind of carbon budget in a cyclic way every 5 years and present detailed plan to the parliament. Interestingly, some of you would know that I think just yesterday or early this morning, the UK government's carbon plan had been judged as illegal because some people took them to court to say, look, this plan is vague, it's not detailed, it does not have the level of granularity that is required to show us that you're going to be on the path to net zero. So the point that Philip is making is actually important, that is this net zero challenge is not only for developing countries, something that is alive also in rich countries, including the UK. But back to Nigeria, we are actually quite surprised that nearly 8 months after that climate bill was signed into law, there doesn't seem to be an appetite to actually implement the law. And so, up to this moment in time, the National Council has not been inaugurated. And the inauguration of the National Council is the fundamental first step that is required to implement the law. And so, I have been writing quite recently that Nigeria stands very much almost, in default of its own climate change law. Not quite yet, but it is getting there because the climate change law expects the carbon budget to be presented exactly 1 year to the sign of the law. And there's a lot of processes that's required for that to happen. So it seems to me that they're already going to fall foul of the law. However, if you set aside the sort of disappointment with the law on the one side, there's quite a lot of progress that has been made on a number of other fronts. So, for example, there has been a lot of emphasis on scaling up the amount of renewable energy in the country. Well, the government is also saying that the huge expansion in the use of gas is part of its climate policy. And if you like, actually, there are some people who argue that one of the whole essence for which the net zero target was made at COP26 was to provide some kind of logical scientific veneer or for the government to be able to say that they can use the gas as much as up to 2040. And so based on that, the government has launched what is called a national gas expansion plan, which involves getting more and more gas, CNG, LPG, etc., to be the basis of transportation, energy production, but also to replace household hazardous cooking. And the government is also at the moment drafting a low emission long-term plan, which is supposed to give some kind of quantification to the LTV. And so there's also the promise to plant 25 million trees, which some people will argue has not quite gone on the way that one envisages. So there's all these pockets of there's of course also some low carbon agricultural policy which is being implemented. So there's a bit of activities here and there in all kinds of various sectors. But if you ask me, I would say not anywhere near the scale of what is required to tackle the challenge. And I like the point that Philip made that, and sort of implied in what Navrov was saying also, that beyond the 2050 target, we need also to be thinking about what are the key short-term measures that needs to be taken in the next 5 to 10 years that is going to propel these countries into the path of a much lower emission trajectory, but also open up opportunities for more sustainable growth. And that, I think, is what needs to really focus our mind. But I'll be remiss if I don't come back to the other points that Philip made, which I, in a sense, agree with, but I think also bears some challenges. The idea that, poor countries should, reorientate their minds away from, asking for help from North and kind of strap their boot and do it alone. Is sort of, what, and there's an Igbo proverb that says that you cannot beat a child and tell the child not to cry. Okay, so it's double whammy tragedy, double whammy unfairness. It is not to say that poor countries should not be doing what they can locally, nationally. And indeed, I will argue that many of them are already punching far above their weight. Many African countries have put forward robust NDC targets. Many are spending huge amount of money from their budget. Nigeria have raised 2 times green bond to help to implement low carbon activities. But for countries like the US and France and UK that trashed the planet for hundreds of years and profited hugely from that process, to suddenly say, well, guys, you know what? try and do it by yourself and stop looking at us for help. It's great, to be honest. And as Navrov was saying, if we want to do this thing, I talk about, low emission development or net zero, we have to do it in a way that is fair. And it is not fair that it takes somebody in New York, where Philip lives, one day to have as much emission as it takes somebody in Chad 2.5 years to emit. The difference is staggering, it's humongous, it's unimaginable almost. And so what I say to African countries and government that I advise is, yes, set up the ambitious target, but also be robust in challenging the North to fund it. The Nigerian ETP will cost 410 billion. That's nearly 40 billion per year between now and 2060. We want that money from Felipe's government. We want a substantial amount of that money from France, from Germany, from the UK. They are not coughing up at the moment, and that's marks of hypocrisy. And to be doing that while also saying to Africa, oh, by the way, you should not invest in gas, is kind of, again, double hypocrisy, as many African countries clearly said recently in Shogun, in Kigali. So the problem for me is not the need to focus on absolute emission, because that is important. Some kind of intensity is also important. All these metrics have their value. But I think the fundamental gap that I see now is really the gap on the African side of some kind of lack of seriousness, and from the North, the lack of support to help African countries to get on board and give this the level of urgency it requires. And I want to close by, again, challenging Navros' point about the global signal. I think that we can find, both historically and currently, a strong link between global signals and domestic action. And the global signals are important, especially for Nigeria. If I'm sitting as the president of Nigeria and I hear that up to 42 countries and 51 principalities have said that they're not going to be using diesel vehicles in their jurisdiction from 2040, that is a major signal that I need to be thinking about in making my investment today. So these things are not unaligned, but the problem is the mechanics to make sure that we are able to implement the targets that we set. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot. I just have to say I'm very happy that there's a bit of friendly disagreement on this panel, because oftentimes you just have people agreeing and then it gets a bit boring. So this is very exciting. Thank you very much for the friendly disagreement. But I think the points you're making, personally, I would say are very, very complimentary. I want to bring in Philippe. I know we have just a few minutes left, because we want to try to see if we can take one or two questions from people who are joining us remotely. Philippe, I think a lot has been thrown your way. But one thing I would want to frame in all of what I've heard so far is it actually brings us to the issue of historical responsibility here, which is something we're all kind of dancing around, but increasingly it's becoming very, very salient that, a lot of countries in the global south are being heavily impacted by extreme weather events, by rising temperatures, rising sea levels, and they do not have the financing. But they need to take action now. The imperative of acting today is there. It's very, very urgent. Promises that have been made around providing $100 billion, for example, at Copenhagen, they've not materialized. That pledge, if I'm not mistaken, is expiring in a year or two. The money is not forthcoming. Whilst the point that you made, I very much agree with it, that countries need to figure out how to source that needed financing. Africa, for example, needs $50 billion in adaptation financing every year, $50 billion. At the same time, the support is needed from wealthy countries, but also countries that bear some of the responsibilities for what we're experiencing today. So how do you respond to that and other things you may want to pick up on from what you've heard?
Okay, great, thanks. So let me start from a point of agreement, I think, between all the presenters, which is that while we may disagree on the utility of the long-term goal, what is critical is what happens over the next 5 to 10 years. And to my mind, the long-term goal influences what happens over the next 5 to 10 years. In fact, we're in 2030, what happens over the next 5 to 10 years from 2030 will also be critical, also from a political economy perspective. On the issue of dependency that Chooks made, and I think it ties into the point you're making, Zainab, now, which is I didn't want to be misunderstood, which is clearly the global north, which, as you have indicated, is responsible for a lot more of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere, which is why there isn't room to put a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere, because it supported the development of the global north, bears a responsibility, and it's actually in its interest to support the low carbon development across the global south. And equally important, to support economic development, because at the end of the day, one thing that I think we probably all agree on here is you will not achieve successful decarbonization across the global south unless you do it in a manner that is compatible with increasing standards of living across the global south. People often talk about, when I go into discussions, climate change is the binding constraint. No, I think when it comes to the global south, development, ensuring continued development, is the overarching imperative. And it's a question of figuring out a way of doing that that's compatible with low emissions. Why? In part because the global south will suffer. I mean, people sometimes ask me, whoa, is China interested, or is India interested in low carbon? I say, in some ways, they have to be, because they will not be able to achieve a level of economic growth that will be able to outpace the type of destruction that climate change will produce. The point I was trying to make is that too much of the international discourse is fundamentally oriented towards the United States and the European Union, as opposed to developing solutions that are better adapted to some of the realities in the global south. So, for example, in India, the Bureau of Energy Efficiency several years ago worked with industry to develop more efficient fans, because in India, millions and millions of fans are sold all the time, and traditional households, most households, don't have access to air conditioners. So that was a development of something that was very well suited to the realities in India. Another example is that when you look across the global south, state-owned enterprises tend to dominate the energy sector. They're major emitters, but they also tend to be major suppliers of low carbon alternatives, hydropower and the like. A lot of the discourse you get out of the Washington consensus institutions, including the IMF, is we need to eliminate state-owned enterprises. But the reality is, whether it's in India, Indonesia, and other countries, state-owned enterprises are a reality. They're going to be there in 10, 15 years. You have to figure out a way of engaging with them. So the big point I was really trying to make was that it is critical to try to develop policies that are well adapted to the domestic situation. I joined the World Bank in 1990. Navas was talking about 1970. I was probably too young in 1970, but I joined the World Bank in 1990. And one of the big changes of the world since 1990 to today is the explosion of the Chinese economy. And that has fundamentally altered a lot of the dynamics between North and South. And it also has altered the whole common but differentiated responsibility issue, as China has migrated from a small, poor emitting country to a much wealthier, rich emitting, well, not on a per capita basis, but a large emitting country. And I guess the point I'm making is much of that was done not consistent with the precepts and the principles that were put forward by the Washington Consensus Institution. So a basic point that I was making is I think that it is critical, as the Global South looks to meet its dual objectives, one that the Global North does not have, that it assert greater leadership in the area of international climate efforts, so that its values and its needs are preserved and respected. That will require a lot more financing, and it goes well beyond the $100 billion. As I had cited, the IEA and others point to $600 to $1 trillion worth of additional financing by 2030 in order to support the low carbon transition across the global south. And that doesn't even include China.
Great. So we have just a few minutes to go, and we got some questions. I'll just read all of them, and then maybe we can just do one round and then we conclude. So the first one we got is this. Let me read it. So the first is policies made at the global level, and this is from David Omata, should be domesticated using each country's specific economic strategy is what the person is trying to say. Then a second question is, or comment is, the trade-offs between the SDG 7 and 13, which directly promote the net zero target, should be analyzed with other SDGs like 1, 2, 6, and 8. Otherwise, there won't be a balance. A third one is that net zero transition should be a gradual process, especially for Africa, where the continent has contributed less than 3.5% of global emissions. Then another one from Michael is net zero feasible at all? Or like Mr. Navrosh pointed out, signaling, is it sustainable to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, given that there has been a turn in that greenhouse gases are now being utilized? I don't quite understand what the person is trying to say. And then the final one is, based on the economic potentials of greenhouse gas utilization, I think the person may be talking about carbon capture and storage, if I'm not mistaken. Will lowering emissions make sense for the sustainable growth of these companies? So, are there any questions or the comments you would like to address? I guess the final one from me is, what should we expect as we head to COP27? What do you see happening? Is there anything you would like to highlight for us to keep track of? And again, given the fact that just between last year and now, things have really shifted considerably, not least the war in Ukraine. And I think, as Philip mentioned, the energy security of the EU has become very salient. And I think maybe India, less so India, but more Africa is really experiencing that firsthand. We're seeing European Union delegations going to Senegal, Nigeria, Angola, South Africa, Botswana to source dirty fuel, not just gas, not just oil, but also coal. South Africa is increasing its exports of coal to Germany. So that's a bit of an interesting dynamic there. So generally, what should we expect as we head to COP27? And how will these figure into negotiations and discussions at that summit? Who wants to come first?
Okay, so first, in response to some of the questions, which are not extremely clear, but I think we get the point some of them are trying to make. I would like to conclude by saying that whilst I have argued for in favor of the net zero, it should be, and I think I made a point previously, that the pathways to achieving this net zero has to be open. Each country will need to decide the pathway that best work for them. Trying to impose a particular unitary, homogeneous narrative on countries will not work. And there has been a bit of a tendency to do that in the past, and I hope that vulnerable countries can continue to resist that. Looking forward to COP27 is a bit unfortunate. Zainab, as you said, the geopolitical happenings do not favor a big COP where it's being hosted. Of course, Egypt doesn't have this kind of resources to mount a kind of razzmatazz and ramp the discourse ahead of the COP itself. There is no major agreement that needs to be finalized at COP27. Where you have COPs where a particular agreement needs to be finalized is actually kind of give some kind of high profile, so just COP, but this is not the case. And now the UK government, who have been saying that they want to ensure that the gains made in COP26 is sustained in COP27, has suffered a major, political setback. And Boris Johnson will not be there at COP27 because he's resigned. And then, of course, you have the war in Ukraine and the if you like, the new rise for dirty fuel. So all of these things lead me to suggest that there might not be an explosive COP27. But it worries me from an African perspective because we really do need to ensure that all of these things are not, that we don't allow climate to fall off this cliff because of all of these things. As Philip has said, if we don't act on climate change, it's also the poor countries that are going to suffer the impact the most. So it is really important that we keep we keep our foot on the pedal. However, I expect at COP27 perhaps some kind of surprise on two levels. Number one is maybe there is a new facility for loss and damage. Many people have now seen that this is happening. And more, it's become difficult for rich countries to kick it further down the can, as many of them have begun to also experience loss and damage in their jurisdictions. And number two, who knows, there could be some rabbits out of the hole through the announcement of a new sort of just energy transition partnership with some more African countries. However, as you have said, we've seen that the announcement of such just energy transition partnerships, why they are hailed as breakthroughs in diplomatic and just climate diplomacy. They may not represent a golden, it's not an El Dorado by any stretch of imagination, because things can still go wrong, as we see that in South Africa, nothing has happened since that deal was signed.
Right. Thank you, Chooks. Let me bring in Philippe, and then Navros will have the closing word. Philippe?
Yeah, so I think, building on what Chooks said, I think the expectations regarding COP27 have probably dropped, right? I mean, when it was announced last year, it was going to be the African COP, it was going to be the COP about adaptation, and obviously you see even in the discussions, just by analogy to what happened at the G20, where the initial statement coming out of a lot of countries has to be about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, while the Indonesian hosts were saying, well, can we talk also about some other things like massive starvation and things like that are threatening a variety of countries. I think what's unfortunate, and what we see reflected in the G20 discussions, is that the international consensus has frayed around what's been happening with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But having said that, I think also sometimes these type of situations provide opportunities for surprises. That as people maybe look for ways where they can come to some agreement, maybe we'll see some greater consensus on some specific points coming out of COP27. I will make two related comments. Chooks made the comment about me being in New York. In some sense, just pushing back a little, we talk a lot about whether Boris Johnson is going to be there or not. To be frank, I think that shouldn't be a critical issue. And I think we need to talk less about what happens in the United Kingdom with a population of 60 million people and an emissions level of actually India is just surpassing the UK's GDP. So that goes back to the other point I was making, is we also, I think, over the next, whether it's COP27 or in 5 years or 10 years, we need to be looking at an international architecture on climate in which many of the critical emerging economies are playing a much bigger leadership role. COP27 in some ways might have been the beginning of that, but I think it's been overtaken again by some sort of more Eurocentric issues. We need to sort of shift the discussion when it comes to climate in order to serve the interests of African nations and other vulnerable countries.
Okay. Navros, the final word to you.
Yes, thank you. So three quick points. First, I'm in violent agreement with Chooks when he talks about the fact that however we talk about global climate action, it has to leave open the likelihood, in fact, the necessity of multiple pathways for different countries. I think without that, there will be a sense in which countries feel hemmed in, and there will be sort of a pushing back. And part of my trying to interrogate the net zero story is because I see that closing down that conversation. So just to give you one example, there was a recent Yale Columbia Environmental Performance Index that was put out globally, and their benchmark of countries' scores on climate change was based on whether the last 10 years of emissions will put a country on track to reach net zero in 2050. Now, a country, any developing country with rising emissions is not going to be, that's not the right benchmark to apply for most developing countries. But that is the benchmark that is being applied in a crude way. And that's my concern about the net zero kind of conversation. It really acts in this blanket way to obscure differences across countries because it's not applied with the necessary nuance and sophistication. So that's, I just want to make it clear where I'm coming from on that. The second point, but the multiple pathways, absolutely. I think that we could probably all get very strong agreement in this group on that. The second point I'd make is a lot depends, perhaps not by Sharm el-Sheikh, but in the next few years, is how strongly this opportunity story takes hold. And I feel that the international process since Paris is sort of the supportive part of the process. The driver is actually national politics. Will countries see their future opportunities, and this is North and South, lying in a low carbon development story? And here, recent developments in the US are really disheartening, because if a rich country, which has more than adequately met all of its basic needs, sits on, has the largest, most influential financial industry in the world, if it cannot find a way to make its politics build its politics around climate change as an opportunity, what does that mean for much poorer countries where the transition is going to be much harder, where the cost of capital is much higher, where capital is more scarce, and the opportunity cost of that capital is much greater? So I worry about this. I think there is the glimmer of an opportunity story. If the US can't tell that story domestically, it'll make everybody else turn around and say, well, maybe we're missing something here. And I worry about that. The third thing is picking up again on the finance story. And I think there was a lot of hoopla around the South African the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership story. And I think that's going to be a big question for Sharm el-Sheikh. Are we going to see real money on the table, real things happening? There's discussion in India about something similar. But even if that comes through, there's a residual nagging fear I have. We might see money flowing to a few large developed countries that could be showcased as bending their mitigation curve, with money going to do that. That would be a best case scenario. But what about the many other smaller countries? What about money for adaptation and loss and damage? You don't have the same kind of political alignment behind that. So I think that it's quite important to keep the pressure and the spotlight on some of those issues for other developing countries as well, through Sharm el-Sheikh and beyond.
Great. I think you've summarized the key issues we've discussed today, and you've made my job easier as well. And I'm going to start with the financing point, absolutely crucial. I've also been making similar points about the jet. Initially, I was quite excited about it, but then upon further reflection, I started thinking, what about Comoros? What about, the Solomon Islands? What about Vanuatu and all these islands that are already facing rising sea levels? They don't have the clout of an India or an Indonesia or South Africa, to be able to kind of, use their sheer muzzle to get some kind of commitment from wealthy countries, so that, which then leads us to really despair, in a sense, at the fact that these big multilateral fora are not quite bringing different stakeholders to arrive at a consensus, the consensus needed to be able to take certain kinds of action, because that's how these smaller and more vulnerable countries can actually get something done, through multilateral fora. So if those fora are increasingly not as effective as we would want them to be, it's something for us to really despair about and try to think of ways to make those things happen. I guess the other thing I'll just kind of mention by way of conclusion is, from this discussion, we have come to the realization that, of course, the net zero pledges, the global narrative itself is an important signal. It gets certain things done. Suddenly we're having companies, investment banks, all thinking and at least talking about net zero pledges and trying to start shaping some of their investment decisions. But at the same time, without a clear alignment and a clear localization with respect to domestic policy processes, we're not going to see much progress being made. So thank you very much to all of you, distinguished panelists. We're very happy to have you here. You've certainly enriched this discussion. I know a lot of people are following this conversation, and I'm sure you're going to have people reach out to you individually. So thank you very, very much. Also to all of those who have joined us remotely from all over the world, and to our team here at the Carnegie Endowment for making sure that we have concluded this event glitch-free. Have a nice day, everyone. Thank you.